In a quiet town on the edge of nowhere, where the days felt long and the nights even longer, lived a man named Daniel. People knew him as the local mechanic, the guy who could bring dead engines back to life. His small garage, tucked between a diner and an old bookstore, was filled with the smell of grease, coffee, and old memories. Daniel didn't talk much, didn't smile much either, but there was a kindness in his eyes that people noticed when they really looked. He lived alone, worked hard, and kept to himself until the day his past came knocking in the form of a promise. Years ago, Daniel had a best friend named Leo. They had grown up together, raced bikes down dirt roads, and dreamed about changing the world. Leo had taken the medical path, always wanting to help people, while Daniel stayed with machines, always more comfortable around tools than textbooks. But they had stayed close, even when life pulled them in different directions. Then, 2 years ago, everything changed. Leo had been diagnosed with a rare illness. Daniel visited him often in the hospital, watching the bright, passionate friend he loved grow weaker day by day. On one of those visits, just weeks before the end, Leo had pulled Daniel close and whispered something that never left his mind. "If anything happens to me, promise me you'll look after Ella." Daniel had nodded, not really understanding what that would mean. He had only met Ella a couple of times, Leo's younger sister, quiet and shy, with eyes that looked like they had seen too much. She was studying nursing at the time, working odd jobs to pay for school. After Leo passed, Daniel had sent a few messages her way, checking in, making sure she was okay. But they weren't close. Not until the day she walked into his garage carrying a small, shaking boy in her arms. His name was Max, just 5 years old, pale and thin, with eyes too big for his face. Ella looked tired, older than her years, her hair pulled into a messy ponytail, her hands trembling slightly as she explained. Max had a lung condition, one that required careful management and expensive equipment. The hospital had sent them home, saying there was nothing more they could do unless they could afford a new breathing device, one that cost more than Ella made in 3 months. She was desperate. Someone at the clinic had told her about Daniel, not because he was a doctor, but because he had once built a simple breathing support machine for a friend in the past. That story had spread quietly among the nurses, like a small flicker of hope in a world that didn't offer much of it. Daniel didn't say much that day. He just looked at Max, then at Ella, and nodded. "Let me see what I can do." It had been so long since he had opened the dusty box tucked under his workbench. The one that held Leo's old notebooks, full of half-finished designs, hand-drawn schematics, and wild ideas about cheap, adaptable medical devices. Leo had always believed machines could save lives if used the right way, and Daniel had promised to keep that dream alive. Now, maybe, this was the moment. That night, Daniel barely slept. He sat under the harsh lights of his garage, flipping through pages covered in fading ink. His hands moved without thinking, soldering, cutting, adjusting small valves and wires. He wasn't trying to build a miracle, just something that worked. Something that might give Max a little more time, a little more strength. Meanwhile, Ella stayed nearby, sleeping on the old couch in the corner. Max curled up beside her with a blanket and a toy truck Daniel had found in a box of spare parts. The soft sound of his breathing filled the room, a reminder of how fragile he was and how important it was not to fail. In the days that followed, the town began to notice something was going on. The local diners started sending over extra meals. A retired nurse dropped by with medical textbooks from the 90s. A high school science teacher showed up one afternoon to offer her help testing oxygen flow rates. It wasn't a big town, but people cared in their own quiet ways. They remembered Leo, remembered his kindness. And now they saw his sister and this strange mechanic trying to do something that felt bigger than both of them. Daniel found himself working harder than he ever had. Not just for Max, but for Leo. Every wire he connected, every adjustment he made, felt like a step closer to keeping a promise that mattered more than anything. He started seeing things differently, too. Ella wasn't just Leo's sister anymore. She was brave, smart, and strong in a way that didn't ask for attention. She took notes on everything Daniel did, asked careful questions, and stayed up late reading about respiratory support systems online. Together, they started improving the design, adding sensors, building backup systems, testing airflow at different pressure levels. One evening, just as the sun was setting behind the garage and casting golden light across the floor, Daniel looked over and saw Ella watching Max sleep. Her face was soft in that light, and for the first time, he noticed something else in her eyes, something more than worry or fear. It was hope. And he realized then that maybe he wasn't just keeping a promise anymore. Maybe he was becoming part of something new, something he hadn't expected. The device wasn't perfect. Not yet. But it was working. Max had more energy. He was eating again. He laughed at Daniel's terrible jokes and insisted on helping him clean tools, even though he barely knew what they were. The hum of the machine Daniel had built was steady and comforting, like the purr of an old engine running smooth. And still, Daniel worked. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't just about one boy or one promise. It was about finding a way to fix something that had been broken long before Max ever got sick. It was about honoring the memory of a friend who believed in the impossible and in Daniel. The days started to blend together inside that small garage, where the scent of engine oil now mixed with antiseptic and the quiet rhythm of a modified breathing machine. Daniel no longer kept track of the hours. Morning and night didn't mean much when you were chasing a solution that could change everything. His hands, rough from years of car repair, had grown surprisingly gentle as he adjusted tiny valves and delicate tubing. Every piece of the machine became a part of something bigger. Every change had purpose. Ella was always there, often curled up with medical printouts or taking notes on a legal pad that had grown thick with sketches and handwritten data. Her presence brought a strange sense of calm, even in the middle of so much uncertainty. She worked with quiet focus, sometimes humming softly as Max colored nearby or napped with a blanket pulled up to his chin. The boy's color had improved. His lips weren't as pale, and his breathing had grown steadier. There was still a long road ahead, but signs of progress brought with them a kind of fragile hope that filled the corners of the garage like sunlight through a dusty window. Daniel had stopped asking himself why he cared so much. Somewhere along the way, Ella's fight had become his own. She wasn't just Leo's sister anymore. She was someone who refused to give up, even when it seemed like every system, every professional, every piece of paperwork had said no. Daniel respected that deeply. And somewhere in the quiet hours of working side by side, his respect turned into something else, something softer that he couldn't quite name. He would catch himself watching her as she bent over the workbench, her brow furrowed in thought, her fingers tracing a diagram as if trying to pull answers from the page. He noticed the way her tired face would brighten when Max managed a few playful steps, or how her shoulders would finally relax when the machine hummed at the perfect setting. It was a quiet kind of connection that didn't need words. Just presence. Just understanding. Outside the garage, the world kept moving, but slowly, the town began to take more notice. People stopped by more often, not to get their cars fixed, but to ask if there was anything they could do. A retired engineer brought over some spare sensors and an old pressure gauge. A nurse dropped off extra oxygen tubing. Someone even donated a small hospital-grade monitor they weren't using anymore. The community, once distant, now seemed to pulse with quiet support. Daniel had never asked for help, but it came anyway, unspoken and steady, like a rising tide. The old mechanic who never smiled much was suddenly the center of something he didn't expect, a movement built on care, on belief, on the shared hope that maybe, just maybe, something beautiful could come out of this effort. Max had become a symbol of that hope. His laughter returned slowly, first in soft chuckles and later in full giggles when Daniel let him sit in a broken-down truck and pretend to drive. He still needed the breathing support, but now he could sit upright for longer, eat more, even ask questions about how the machine worked. His curiosity reminded Daniel of Leo, bright, inquisitive, always poking around to understand how things connected. That resemblance sometimes hit Daniel like a quiet wave, but instead of drowning in the memory, he found it comforting. It reminded him of why he was doing this, of the promise he had made. He had told Leo he would look after Ella, but now he understood that the promise was never just about protecting. It was about building something that would last. One evening, as rain tapped softly on the roof of the garage, Daniel sat with Leo's notebook spread open in front of him. Pages were stained, edges curled, but the diagrams still spoke to him like old friends. There were unfinished ideas, formulas half-solved, wild sketches of devices that hadn't yet been built. Daniel saw the dream within those pages, not just of machines, but of making life better for people who had been overlooked. It struck him then how unfair it had been that Leo never saw this happen. He had planted seeds that were only now beginning to grow, and it was Daniel who had the chance to bring them into the world. It felt heavy, that kind of responsibility, but also right. Ella brought him a cup of coffee, the steam rising between them like smoke from an old engine. She sat beside him, her eyes scanning the notebook with the same quiet focus that had become familiar. There was peace in that moment, in the shared silence between two people who had found purpose in the middle of pain. Daniel glanced at her hand resting on the table, and for a fleeting second, he wanted to reach out. But he didn't. Not yet. The time wasn't right. What they were building, this machine, this trust, this connection, needed space to grow. And he wasn't sure if she saw him the same way yet. But still, he stayed close. Progress continued. They added new features to the breathing device, turning it into something far more advanced than Daniel had imagined possible at the start. It could now adjust airflow based on Max's real-time oxygen levels. It had a fail-safe system, a battery backup, and a handmade alarm that triggered if levels dropped too low. Daniel had used parts from old cars, bits of electronics from discarded appliances, and scraps from the corners of the garage. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And it was theirs. Built not in a hospital lab, but in a mechanic's garage, with love and trial and error, late nights, and stubborn hope. Then, one morning, something went wrong. Max woke up struggling to breathe, his chest rising too quickly, the machine blinking a red light that Daniel had never seen before. Panic set in, quiet but sharp. Daniel and Ella worked together without speaking, checking connections, flipping to backup settings, doing everything they had rehearsed for weeks. Within minutes, they got the machine stable again. Max's breathing slowed, the color returned to his cheeks, and he gave them a thumbs up before dozing off again. But that moment stayed with them. It was a reminder that what they were doing still carried risk, that their creation, while working, still had room to grow, that their fight wasn't over. That night, Daniel sat outside the garage under the stars, the sound of crickets filling the quiet. The promise he had made to Leo echoed again in his mind. It had started with a simple sentence, but it had become something so much more. He had walked into this thinking he could maybe help a little. Now he was standing at the edge of something much bigger, something that could change more than just Max's life. Ella joined him, wrapping herself in a blanket. She didn't say anything, just leaned close, and for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the promise he made years ago had led him to where he was meant to be all along. The news spread faster than Daniel had ever expected. It started with a photo, a candid shot someone had taken of Max sitting up in the garage, smiling with wires from a homemade machine behind him. The caption said nothing more than built with love, saved by hope. But it reached people. It reached hearts. Soon after, a local journalist came by, curious about what was happening in a dusty corner of town that had suddenly become the center of something extraordinary. He listened to their story and wrote it with gentle words, painting Daniel not as a miracle worker, but as a man who had kept a promise when it would have been easier to walk away. The article was shared online, and before long, emails started pouring in, families from nearby towns, even cities, asking if the device could help their child, their sibling, their friend. Some offered money, others offered prayers. Many simply offered their thanks. But with the attention came pressure. Hospitals began to notice. Professionals questioned the safety of the device. Someone filed a complaint, saying it was dangerous, that Daniel wasn't certified, that he had no right to build medical equipment without a license. A formal letter arrived, warning of legal consequences if he continued treating patients or modifying medical devices without approval. The weight of that letter sat heavy on his workbench. For hours, Daniel didn't move. The same hands that had repaired countless engines, that had built a breathing machine from scraps and dreams, now sat still, uncertain. Ella read the letter silently and then folded it carefully, placing it aside. She didn't ask him what he planned to do, didn't tell him what he should feel. She simply sat next to him, her presence steady like always. Max slept nearby, his breathing calm, the hum of the machine filling the quiet space with rhythm. The machine that wasn't perfect, but was working. The machine that had given a little boy a chance to laugh again, to grow, to live. And in that moment, Daniel knew what he had to do. Giving up would mean breaking the very promise that had brought him this far. So he got up, rolled up his sleeves, and went back to work. The community wasn't silent either. The same people who had dropped off spare parts and warm meals now rallied behind him. A petition began circulating, signatures collected at the diner, the pharmacy, the school. Local nurses signed it. So did teachers, shop owners, and even a retired doctor who had once taught Leo. They didn't see Daniel as a rule breaker. They saw him as someone who had stepped in where the system had stepped away. The petition reached the hospital board, along with a detailed report Ella had written herself, explaining how the machine worked, how it had evolved, and how Max's condition had improved because of it. With data, testimonials, and undeniable results, the board agreed to send a team of medical reviewers to evaluate everything formally. When the team arrived, they didn't expect much. But what they saw surprised them. The device, though homemade, was clean, efficient, and carefully documented. Every adjustment had been recorded, every reading tracked. Max, sitting alert and energetic, answered their questions with ease, showing them how the machine helped him breathe. The lead doctor studied the machine in silence for a long time before finally admitting that what they were seeing was not only effective, but potentially innovative. He asked Daniel if he would consider working with a research team to improve the device for broader use. Daniel agreed, but only if it remained open source, free to anyone who needed it. No patents, no price tags, just help. With the medical review completed and the legal cloud beginning to clear, something new started to take shape. A proposal came in to convert part of Daniel's garage into a testing lab for adaptive medical devices. Engineers and doctors began visiting regularly, curious to learn how someone with no degree had created something they couldn't. Ella officially took on the role of research coordinator, balancing her nursing background with the hands-on experience she had gained. She kept everything organized, connected, alive. Max, now growing stronger by the day, became their greatest success story, but not the only one. Other children were brought in, and slowly, Daniel began helping them too. Each one a new puzzle, a new chance to make good on a promise that had become far bigger than he ever imagined. Through all of this, something even more unexpected bloomed. The bond between Daniel and Ella, once built only on shared loss and determination, began to deepen. It was in the way they moved around each other now, without words, without needing to explain. It was in the way she smiled when Daniel forgot to eat, and she handed him a sandwich without a lecture. It was in the way he waited up for her if she worked late, just to make sure she got home safe. There was no big moment, no grand confession. Just two people who had leaned on each other through the hardest days and had come out not just surviving, but building something beautiful. One night, as they sat outside the garage watching Max chase fireflies, Ella rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. No words passed between them. The stars above shimmered gently, and in the soft air of that evening, Daniel understood that he had not only kept his promise to Leo, he had built a new life because of it. A life filled with purpose, with connection, and maybe, just maybe, with love. And somewhere, he believed, Leo would have smiled at how it all turned out. Because the truth was, Daniel hadn't needed a medical degree to help someone. He had needed heart, and a reason to try. That old garage, once filled with broken engines and long silences, now hummed with new life. Machines still lined the walls, but next to them were medical monitors, research notes, and bright crayon drawings from grateful children. Daniel still fixed cars when he had time. It reminded him where he came from. But most of his days were now spent at a new kind of workbench, where he designed devices that listened, not just to symptoms, but to people. Ella worked beside him. Max played nearby, and the sound of the breathing machine, steady and strong, remained in the background like the heartbeat of a new beginning. The sign above the garage had faded over the years, but someone had added a second one beneath it. It read simply, "Built with love." And so the story of a mechanic with no degree, just a promise made to a dying friend, didn't end with one life saved. It became a movement, a home, a future. One that proved sometimes, all it takes to change the world is a little courage, a little kindness, and a vow that no matter how hard things get, you'll keep trying.